working?
You got a pen?
Pens.
Pen? Yeah. Just in case you say anything interesting, I might want to make a note of it.
Is the microphone working here? I can't hear it. It is. Very good. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, this morning even. It's very dark in here. Apologies for the slight delay in getting going. Thank you for joining us for one's 2009 data report launch. We're also briefing the contents of this report into Washington, D.C. today, at the White House and on Capitol Hill, and in briefings in Rome, Berlin, in Cape Town. And we've got a great panel this morning, as you can see. To my left, Bob Geldof, musician and activist, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, international patron of One, chair of the elders, and many other inspirational roles. Arunma Oteh, a vice president of the African Development Bank. Bill Gates, co-chair and founder of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Dr. Francoise Ndayishimiye of the Global Fund, who's the senior gender advisor at the Global Fund. But first of all, we're going to hear a quick clip from Kofi Annan in Cape Town, who just launched the African Progress Panel's report. Do we have the clip from Kofi lined up, please?
4 years ago in Gleneagles, 8 governments and African leaders made a series of solemn promises aimed at tackling extreme poverty. Here in Cape Town, the African Progress Panel is launching its annual report on how Africa is coping and the responsibilities faced by its leaders. One's data report tracks how far G8 governments are keeping their side of the bargain. Both our reports are about leadership, resources, and accountability. Both reports call on governments to honor their commitments and to be accountable to their citizens. Africa's billion people played no part in creating the global economic crisis or climate change, and yet they stand to suffer as the exciting advances of the past decade are threatened. I hope the data report will prove a vital tool in pressing G8 governments to keep their promises in the months to come. Notwithstanding the poor performance of Italy on its aid commitments, we hope that G8 summit next month can still see progress on such vital matters as agriculture and helping Africa to feed itself. In the end, it is Africans who will develop Africa. But towards that end, we are lucky to have the partners we do, working together towards ending poverty and injustice on the continent.
So we partner in, we monitor the G8 through the data report, one's data report, just as the African Progress Panel monitors African governance against these commitments made in Gleneagles between 2005 and 2010. And if you like, the data report is a kind of a statistical bedrock of analysis that gives the empirical evidence for one's activism. And I'm going to hit some of these statistics now. So in the data of the data report, we find on debt, the G8 are delivering on debt, on debt cancellation. At least $1.8 billion was freed up in 2008 that is being spent on development finance that would have gone into debt service payments. However, 11 of the 20 countries at completion point, an advanced stage of the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, are now threatened by increasing debt distress because of the economic crisis. On trade, the G8 are plainly failing. Due to the recent commodity boom, there have been some impressive improvements in African exports from 2% in '98 of world exports to 3.5% in 2008, but none of this was due to G8 policy. This is the commodity boom. The failure of Doha says it all there. On investment, FDI to Africa has increased from 17.5 billion to over 30 billion between 2005 and 2007, though that is declining off again because of the economic crisis more recently, a 15% decline in 2008. There has been some improvements in G8 policy in this area. Things like the investment climate facility are making a modest difference, but those need to be built upon aggressively. On health, agriculture, education and water, the G8 are collectively failing, but some individual nations stand out positively. For example, the United States specifically on health, and to some extent France on the Global Fund. And the UK on education, Canada on education, and Germany on water. But collectively, on all of these separate sectors, the G8 are failing. On aid quality, there actually have been some improvements since the Accra Aid Effectiveness Summit in September last year, and this report goes further than previous reports in ranking the G8 in their performance. We see the UK as the most effective aid-giving country, and Italy as the least effective. We talk in the report about smart aid. There's been a lot of debate about live aid and dead aid, and we talk in the report about smart aid, results-driven aid. And the increases of recent years have gone into programs that are delivering measurable results. For example, 34 million more children in school in Africa, approximately 3 million more Africans on antiretrovirals since 2003. The global figure is 4 million, and we estimate in the report 3 million of those are in Africa. Malarial death rates halved in countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia and Zambia, and the spread of bed nets across the continent has increased from 3% of those in need receiving these insecticide-treated bed nets to 39%. So it's real measurable improvements that have been driven by African leadership with the support of increased international development assistance. On aid quantity, which is the backbone of the Gleneagles commitments, we see that collectively the G8 promised $21.5 billion increase by 2010. By the end of 2008, they had delivered $7 billion, or 1/3 of that promised increase. By the end of 2009, they will have delivered $10.5 billion, or just under 1/2 of the promised increase, leaving 2010 to deliver the rest of the increase, the final half. We also find that 80% of the shortfall in 2009 comes from two countries, Italy and France. Looking more specifically at the groupings of individual countries, we can see that there are 3 countries that have made quite modest promises but are meeting or exceeding their targets: the United States, Canada and Japan. These countries made the most modest promises, it has to be underlined, in 2005, but they are meeting or exceeding those promises. The United States made the biggest quantity promise out of that group, and we're hoping that when President Obama visits Africa soon, he will clarify how much of the further doubling the United States is committed to will go for Africa. That has yet to be clarified. We're also hoping that Canada will build upon its improvements in aid since Gleneagles and use that as a platform for doing more at their G8 next year. The UK and Germany made much bigger promises than the non-European G8 countries and are striving valiantly to reach them, and in particular the UK has committed to 0.7 by 2012-13, would make the UK the first G8 nation to reach 0.7. There's also strong bipartisan support for this in the UK, as there is in Germany. However, France and Italy stand out. France's performance has been disappointing. They've just delivered 7% of their promise. There was a $611 million cut, we estimate from preliminary figures, in 2008 from France to Africa, making, if that's correct, Germany now a bigger donor to Africa than France. And Italy's performance has been an utter failure. They are the host this year of the G8, and this underlines, I think, some issues of credibility for the host and the nature of the G8 structure that we would like to see reform going forward if this is going to be a credible body for decision making. We need it to be. So these improvements need to be made. So I've abbreviated that somewhat because we started late. So I would like now to turn to Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Yes. Thank you very much. I expect that most of us tend to be deeply distressed, devastated often. I mean, when you look at Darfur, you look at Zimbabwe, DRC, Burma, Tibet, and you say, oh, for goodness sake, when are we going to get good news? There is obviously a great deal of evil and suffering in the world, but I would want us also to be aware that there are people such as yourselves who care. Some of the people here are people who represent groups that care. I mean, when we went to Darfur, and the descriptions that you have heard don't prepare you for the reality on the ground, we were particularly struck by the fact that there were those humanitarian workers who keep going back into an awful situation. And I want to stand up and shout loudly for the fact that there are so many young people who are incredibly idealistic, who do believe that poverty can become history, who really believe that it is possible to have a world that is without war. And so I want you, whilst describing the things that the panel has said, what Jamie has said, to remember that there is also a great deal of good. There is a great deal of idealism. I mean, this guy here is quite idealistic, you know.
For once, shut up.
He's... I'm speaking.
Oh, sorry.
That, I mean, it's an incredible thing, you to know that there are so many people who needn't. I mean, they could say, I'm okay, Jack, or I'm okay, Jim, are doing nothing of the sort. And I think that needs to be said. And that evil does not just have a free play. And I come from a position that says this is a moral universe, that right will ultimately prevail. Now, you've heard some of the things that are probably okay, but can you imagine 34 million? Now, that's maybe beyond, it's difficult to feel it. Make it one child, one more child, who would not otherwise have had education, who now goes to school. One child. Put the face of a child you know. Give that face a name. Multiply it by 34,000. We're not speaking about figures, okay? We're speaking about the child of, the son of, the brother of. And so, fantastic that this has happened. Imagine if you were in a family that is affected by AIDS, and your breadwinner had received a death warrant, and you saw this person slipping away, and then they get antiretroviral drugs, and you see a metamorphosis. We thought our mother was dying. Now our mother is well enough to go to work. 3 million such, because aid has been given. And we hope that the G8 will recognize that they made what were believed to be solemn promises. And one wants to commend very specially Gordon Brown, who was the one who underlined that they wanted by 2012 to have reached this 0.7%, and commend the Conservatives for saying that there are two areas where they are not going to change policy. It is what the Labour Party says about health, national health, and about international aid. So I think we should commend them. We should commend them and mention that there is good news whilst clobbering those who are failing to produce. I mean, India and so Italy and France. I just wanted to say there is good news. There is good news. There are incredible human beings in this world. Human beings like yourselves. Human beings who care. Human beings who say it is possible for this world to become a compassionate world, a caring world, a gentle world, a sharing world.
Thank you, Father.
Archbishop has said that there is a moral obligation. I think that there are great business reasons why the support that Africa has enjoyed needs to continue. We live in an interconnected world, and I believe that Africa's success can truly fuel global demand. But Africa is still predominantly dependent on aid. And over the last few decades, aid has fueled the reforms that we've seen in Africa. And that has led to a sustained growth of about 6% over the last decade. But just as we were beginning to start to see its impact, a much more pro-poor growth, the global crisis which has come upon Africa and all of us on the heels of a food crisis, which has had the most devastating impact on the poorest in Africa, is about to dissipate all of the hard work and all of the support that Africa has received over several years. Pre-crisis levels of total needs of Africa, we estimated at the African Development Bank, were about $60 billion per year. Post-global crisis, it's about $120 billion if we're going to meet the Millennium Development Goals in Africa. In addition, we're seeing the interest that we've seen from the private sector dissipate. African governments are having no access or limited access to capital markets. FDI, foreign direct investments, is dwindling. Important projects in infrastructure, which will fuel further growth. We're seeing that promoters are looking to either reduce their participation or not getting involved. Export revenues are dwindling. This year and next year, the estimates are that export revenues will dwindle by about $250 billion. Governments are seeing tax revenues dwindle. Even remittances that in the past has been resilient, this year we expect that it will decline by at least 6%. So what we're seeing is the gains that we've made over several decades run the risk of dissipating. The success that we're seeing in terms of good governance, which has been fueled by aid across Africa, also we run the risk of losing the gains in that respect. Therefore, more than ever before, I think aid is extremely critical for Africa, and we need to front load, and where the opportunities to scale up aid, it's even more important. There are of course challenges in managing aid. But today we're seeing that, as data had noted earlier, we're seeing that aid is smart, is getting smarter. We can measure better. There's more transparency, there's more accountability, and there's a greater sense of responsibility. But most importantly, given the difficult times that we face, and given Africa's aid dependency, aid's role is generally counter-cyclical because there are no other options. And if we have to sustain the gains that we've made, if Africa has to participate in helping us get out of this global crisis, given our interconnected world, we do need aid to be scaled up today and to be front-loaded. That's what I thought I should share.
Thank you, Arunma. Bill?
Well, good morning. I wanted to try and create a picture of what this aid really does. We've got $7 billion of incremental aid. We're saying that it's important to get the additional $14 billion to get to the full promise. Well, this aid is going overwhelmingly to health, education, and agriculture. And these are very measurable activities. In the area of health, you all know about the Global Fund. Well, for every extra billion, they're able to put 1 million people on treatment. And there's nothing more vivid in the world of saving a life than to look at somebody before they go on treatment and after. It's avoiding a death sentence, and as the Archbishop said, that has an impact on their entire family and extended relatives. Another thing that's been funded by this additional aid is vaccines. There's the Global Alliance for Vaccines that's now made available in Africa some of the vaccines that have only been in the rich countries, hepatitis B, HIV, and that has saved over 3 million lives. When you put $1 billion into vaccines, you save 500,000 lives. If we had a picture of one of those children we'd save, everybody would have a direct emotional connection to that. Well, here we're talking about 500,000 for each of the $1 billion of aid that's provided here. And as you improve health, you get follow-on benefits that are quite important. In fact, the population growth rate starts to come down as health improves, and that means all the challenges, whether it's education, food, jobs, environmental impact, they're improved by these things. Likewise, with agriculture, we're talking about the poorest farmers who are impacted by climate change and need better crops, better ways of storing things, better productivity. And in education, we're talking about the thing that enables particularly girls to go out and fulfill their potential. So this aid is measurable and very impactful. The money that's come has made a difference, and that's why we want to see the promises completely fulfilled. In terms of countries, I will say that even outside the G8, there's some very interesting trends. There are countries that have always been great on aid and have maintained that. Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Luxembourg. These are the countries, the 5, that are above the 0.7%. And some of them, like Norway, are actually committed to be as high as 1%. That is absolutely fantastic. Spain is worth mentioning, although they're not in the G8, they've made a commitment to make increases, and that shows they are prioritizing the needs of the poorest of Africa, even as they face challenges of their own. There are some outstanding promises that are worth highlighting. Malaria, we've got a lot of bed nets going, but the G8 committed to get that number up to 100 million. We're not nearly there yet. Those bed nets are very important and save lives. We have a commitment to fund the polio eradication effort. That is an effort that is very close. The number of cases has been brought down now to just a few thousand per year, but the countries that remain will be very difficult to get the elimination in, and so we need the funding to make this the second disease that's ever been eliminated. And then in agriculture, the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of discussion about additional money for agriculture, and we're hoping in Italy that some of that will become concrete. The poor farmers are the ones who need better seeds, better advice, better inputs, and there's some really wonderful things happening when those resources show up. Finally, the commitments on trade should be emphasized, because those create the mechanism, the incentives that really are central to the long-term stability in a way that aid would not be needed, and so we need to lay that foundation.
Thank you, Bill. And Dr. Francoise.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to address this press conference. Over the past few years, we have finally begun to invest enough in global health to make a real difference. Only a few years ago, AIDS, TB, and malaria were spreading pretty much unchallenged in many countries around the world. Immunization rates had declined for a decade. Millions of women and children who should have lived were dying because they didn't get access to even the most basic health care. As a result, not only did millions of people suffer needlessly, but whole countries were also held back in the development. With a little more than 5 years of substantial investment by the Global Fund, we have seen great progress. And that's what I want to say. We now have opportunity to eliminate malaria as a major health problem in 10 years or less. We are in the process of turning AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable chronic disease today. We have a real opportunity to control drug-resistant TB, which, if it's untended, could turn the diseases into an almost untreatable pandemic, and which would pose a danger to all of us and everywhere in the world. Actually more than 4 million people who would otherwise been dead are still alive today. And thanks to the Global Fund, I am one of those people, and I have many friends of those, and I'm living for that. I'm fighting for that. Every day, another 3,000 lives are saved, every day. By channeling the money to areas which need general health care support, we are also strengthening the ability of developing countries to fight all health problems. We are learning what works so that we can expand health programs to tackle other infectious diseases and maternal and child health problems. By investing in health, we are not spoiling developing countries with aid. No, we are making it possible for them to build a foundation on the basis of which they can invest, produce, and develop. We must no longer see these basic investments in the global public goods as development assistance, something we do out of charity or guilt. On the contrary, we are helping to provide the building blocks of development. It is simply not realistic to expect the developing countries to be able to afford these investments on their own. In fact, we will be misguided if we fail to make these investments, because we all benefit from the development that improved public health makes possible. reducing global health investment now, or allowing them to stagnate just as they are starting to deliver results, would be disastrous. The hard-won gains are fragile, and our efforts are just beginning to pay off. We have seen what we can achieve if we perceive, but we still have a long way to go. Promises made by international community hold out hope for millions of people, including my own family, because we trust that we can survive from the daily disease. If we fail to follow through on these promises and don't go on scaling up the investment in the health, we will betray the trust of people and of million other people that will be in the future. Finally, I need to make clear here that although Italy and France have been mentioned today in many of our discussion, that they are lagging behind on the development assistance, there are the two countries which have invested substantial amount of money in the Global Fund that is helping to save millions of lives. France is the second largest contributor to Global Fund after the United States, and Italy is also a major contributor. For us, we very much appreciated the fact that both countries see the Global Fund as an effective way of channeling ODA. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Francoise. And Bob.
Good morning, everyone. We're running very late, so very briefly, maybe I should contextualize this sort of annual event. We've heard from the great global financial and health institutions. We've heard from the greatest and bravest moral arbiter, little giant, this turbulent priest here beside me. And we've heard from the greatest industrialist of our time, our Rowntree, our Carnegie, or our Morgan, or our Rockefeller. Why? Why did Tutu talk about the idealistic imperative to help another human being? What obligation do we have as a society to help others that we will never know or never see? Why would the person who created technology, being the driver of the modern economy, this modern economy, decide to devote the rest of his entire life and his entire fortune to that end? And why are these workers at the coalface here? It's because that singular condition of poverty is empirical and can be removed. Indeed, it must be removed, because without it, we cannot build a new global financial architecture, one that collapsed because 50% of the planet were not included. They live on less than $2 a day. You cannot live on $2 a day. I'll repeat that. You cannot live on $2 a day. So you die. So we exclude from the world economy the creative dynamic, the intellectual stimulus, the productivity that these people have. By injecting that into the world economy, they can have their own health systems. They can have coherent government. They can buy our stuff and we can buy theirs. And we don't have to give aid anymore. Aid stabilizes at the base level the poor of this world. It manages somehow, sometimes, to get to some people. so that they get to stay alive with a little bit of food. They get to stay healthy with a little bit of medicine, so that they can go to get a little bit of education. And the rest we leave it to the lap of the gods in this case being the G7, who are wholly inadequate. Next year, the world celebrates exactly today, in 1 year, the vivacity of Africa in the World Cup. You will see a wholly different Africa. You see them every Saturday at primetime television. They're called Didier Drogba. They're called the great athletes of the world. Some of their great intellectuals are here today. So if you want to know why this stuff goes on, it's not because, you know, there are some knobheads here from pop music who decide it's cool. It's because there is something logical and imperative about this, that unless we bring the marginal peoples and the peripheral economies into the center of the decision-making processes of the world, our entire system will fall again. China's rich. The Chinese are poor. Africa's poor. The Africans are poorer. But let me remind you of this. As most of us, unfortunately, think of that gorgeous continent as one undifferentiated whole. Let's accept that for the argument here. If we take it as that, then the economy of Africa is the 10th largest economy in the planet. It's greater than India, it's greater than Brazil, it's greater than Mexico. The only other emerging economy greater is China. So why do we build trade barriers against these 900 million producers and consumers? You know, it's self-evident that Africa will grow itself out of this, but for our own sake, let's get them there quicker, because Europe is in decline. We are the oldest, fastest growing continent in the planet. 8 miles south of us is the youngest, the most hungry, literally, the most thirsty. And when that big pipe plugs into Mombasa late in July, and that other big 2 terabyte pipe plugs into Lagos late July, boom. They're coming. Their brains, their creativity, their dynamism, their intellectualism, their physicality is coming. What this does is help to get there. Now, why? Because somehow, presciently, in a great elegant gift to ourselves in 2000, the UN decided we would take the 50% of the world and we would bring half of them into the world economy. Why only half? Why not all of them? Don't know, but they were the MDGs. We didn't know how to get there. So the Commission for Africa planned a route map. And then all of us got together with Make Poverty History, and Live 8 was the pointy end of that to talk to the rest of the world. That's this. Then we had to monitor that. That's the data report. And then the Africans had to monitor their end, and that's the Africa Progress Panel. You just heard Kofi. I'm on both of these things. So now, these two organizations have legitimacy to achieve this mandated end. And the arm that is supposed to do it is the G7. So we give them a report card. It's empirical, it's third party, it's nothing to do with us. Japan, existential economic crisis and political meltdown. Their promise, already met 150%. The United States, fiscal stimulus. We used to call that aid. I believe there's a book saying that aid doesn't work, so may as well give that book to the Americans. Toxic acids is debt cancellation. It's just another word. So if it works for us, why not for them? It does work for them. We know that. It's in the data report. The Americans busily engage in aid and debt relief. 70% achievement. They will meet their target. Canada, next year, the key G7, that will finally meet the Gleneagles target, we hope. Already 206% of what they promised at Gleneagles. And we come to Italy, 3%. 206 for next year, Last year 150%. This year 3%. They've met their promise 3%. Now I'm telling you, if you gave a mate of yours 10 quid to borrow and he gave you 3% back and something more than your next pint depended on it, a certain sense of trust would disappear. What is the legitimacy of this crowd of shysters to run the G7 this year? How dare they? Well, we'll be there, and we expect some of the Italians here present to ensure that their government at least has some legitimacy to run this thing, because how can you possibly trust any government that promises something, does nothing, and expect them to lead the world? How dare they?
Should we finish on that note? I do apologise for the lateness. We're getting to questions from the media, and I think also, Father, you have to leave in a few minutes, but if we can try and do a few questions before you have to go, and then as many of the panel might keep going until Helen tells us we have to run. David.
From the BBC. Bob, you put the point about empirical data and the promises made in 2005, but I wonder, given the G20 emerging as the new global architecture, whether the G8 and beating Italy over the head makes any sense at this stage. I mean, what about Saudi Arabia, China, India, the globalized, the new emerging powers? What responsibility do they have?
A growing one, and much to my dismay, we're beginning to get empirical figures out of the Middle East, led by the Qataris, who are beginning to formalise their aid structures. The Chinese obviously are ploughing money in a different way. I can't remember what the figures are. They're something like 50 billion. They've sort of almost piggybacked with the G7. The problem is, I think there needs to be the problem is that they may create a newer debt crisis, simply because the loans are given without any sort of what's the word?
It's part of the cause of the new debt distress that's being identified alongside the economic
So
crisis.
it needs to be formalised, and it's not something that we're not on. We are on it. It's just that essentially we are here to prod and poke the G7, but you're absolutely correct to raise it, and we raise it as much as possible. I think ultimately it'll come down to, you're quite right, the G20 will be the forum going forward, but God knows, if you can't get 7 of them to get something together, you expect 20.
Martin?
Martin Cloud, BBC. Mr. Gates, your president so far has had a lot on his plate. Clearly he's been focusing on the Middle East, but so far has done almost nothing about Africa. It's been low down on his priorities. He's going to Africa. If you have to say to him one thing you'd like to see President Obama deliver in Africa, what would it be?
I think President Obama has actually been quite good on aid issues. There was a commitment during the campaign to double the United States overseas development assistance. Even as the economy in the U.S. has been tough like everywhere, they've maintained that commitment. As was said, we're hoping as part of this trip to Africa they'll clarify that Africa will get its share, which would be a very substantial amount of that increase. The U.S. with PEPFAR and their gifts to the Global Fund have been very strong. And one thing that's been good about Obama is he's taken that legacy and not said, okay, PEPFAR wasn't his thing. He said, no, we're going to keep growing that. We're going to do some additional health things. So I think it's great, given all the other things going on, that he's making the trip. Even in his speech in Cairo, he highlighted the need to get polio eradication done and the need to work in solidarity with the Muslim majority countries. So I'd say so far it's very impressive how he's kept it on the agenda, and this will be a chance for him to be more concrete.
Thank you. The gentleman in the middle here. Were you raising your hand or stretching? Okay. Gentleman in the tie. Sorry.
Hello, my name is Raphael Satter. I'm with the Associated Press. I was just wondering if any of you had been in contact with aid officials, either in Italy or in France, and had any kind of explanation for why commitments had fallen short there.
Yes, absolutely. We're in constant contact with them. And Ollie Buston, our European director, is leading a team who's in constant consultation with them. And they have confirmed that these figures are accurate and they correctly describe the situation. I'd say that the French would like us to point out that they are at a higher level of GNI spending, much higher than Italy, so they would probably complain about putting in the same bracket. We don't actually put them in the same bracket. France is disappointing. It's Italy that's the great failure here. It's just that we expect more of France, given its cultural connections, its historic connections, and also the degree to which French citizens think they're doing more. So we are in constant contact with them, and I think you can see comments in today's media from Italian officials admitting that this is the story, but also, and the French say likewise, that they are committed to trying somehow to meet these targets. And you can see in the report the statistics they would have to meet in order to meet these targets, and that is some monumental task, but at least they're claiming that they have to try. Catherine. Oh, sorry, I think the lady just behind you had her hand up before.
There are news until Descaturo for Wild Italy. There are news about the Gates Foundation acquiring the property in Salemi, Italy. And I was wondering whether Mr. Bill Gates can confirm that if there's any project plan for the property. It's in Sicily, Salemi.
No, I don't know anything about that.
Oh, well, any other questions about Italian politics by any chance? You've got a G8 coming up? No? Okay, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine Hopkins from The Guardian. I was just wondering, do you think it's now up to other G7 heads, such as Obama and Brown, to step up pressure on Berlusconi and Sarkozy to increase their aid?
I didn't hear what you said.
She said, do you think it's up? Are you going deaf?
Arunma, would you like
Not
to go?
going. I am deaf.
All right.
I think Arunma's going to have a go.
It is an important question, I think, by the example that the UK and the US are showing. If they continue to show that, I think that in and of itself will put pressure on other G8 countries that may not be doing as well. But clearly we need to acknowledge the UK, the government. It's a country where all the politicians, both on the Conservative side and on the Labour side, are very pro and supportive of development. Similarly, it's great that when a new government comes into the US, that they're able to follow through on the commitments that have already been made for them. So if they keep up the way they're going, and they do have the credibility to be able to put pressure on the others. And I think the UK, generally, you have people who have been pro-development and who have always supported development.
Archbishop Tutu, were you formulating a response to the question?
No, I just think, that, if you've got the moral stature, or at least, some coinage that you are able to put a little bit more, and maybe they can do it slightly more graciously than the more strident of us.
Thank you. Lady down here, if we've got a mic nearby, or you can speak up. Holly.
Thank you. My name is Remy Ayala. I'm not with a media organization. But my question is, as the chap from the BBC mentioned, the new global architecture, looking at the G20, are we missing a trick here a little bit by hammering on the G8? Because I feel that there's a lot of aid going on outside, but also there are governments that are getting PR by announcing aid and doing absolutely nothing to follow up on what they're doing. So who's looking at them? Naturally, I can't say that it has to be the one organization that has to, hammer on everybody. But I'm just wondering whether we're missing a trick by concentrating just on the G8.
No,
we don't just concentrate on G8.
Anyway, focus on these guys. They've got the wedge. Just clearly focus. That's where the action is.
This report's about the G8 because they made the bulk of the promises back in 2005. But the OECD DAC, the Development Assistance Committee,
nicely.
monitor technically all that process. Gentleman at the back there, and if you could say from which organisation.
Richard Quest from CNN. Isn't the real danger period from 2010 onwards, as governments start to claw back fiscal stimuli packages, start to really deal with deficits. I mean, we're getting both central bankers and ministers saying that these deficits are unsustainable in the developed world. So notwithstanding what the Conservative Party said this morning or overnight, surely we're going into the most dangerous period for you.
Absolutely. As governments look to cut their deficits, they will look at all parts of their budget. And these parts that are to help the poorest may or may not be cut as part of that process. And so highlighting the positive impact, highlighting the additional need, stating that there really is grassroots support for these things will be particularly important as we get into that period.
Self-interest also. Our economy, we cannot pay back our debt without growing our economy. The logical, cheapest and nearest place to grow that economy out of pure self-interest is on the African continent, where we'll be sucking out so much of our resources anyway from, but extending out from the skittish commodity markets into the real economy, that's in our clear interest. So this is a very, very, very cheap investment.
Also, growth is so fragile in Africa today that if we don't front load the aid, all of the gains that we've made and all of the support that Africa has received over the last few years will just dissipate.
We commissioned some research from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research here in the UK that showed actually the great feedback mechanism, the feedback effect of investing in Africa. Without even tying the aid, there are boosts to our exports and economic growth over the medium term that are quite tangible. Helen, how long do we have here? Okay, Roxy, do you have a question?
Hi, Roxy Filson, One Campaign. One has over 2 million members who've been submitting questions for today, and their number one question, as voted by them, is from Simon Santamu from Tanzania, and he asks, why should we Africans expect President Sarkozy, Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Berlusconi to live up to their 2005 promises and commitments, while many of our leaders are not living up to their promises to eliminate grand corruption, nor are they meeting their commitments to the African peer review mechanism?
These one activists ask excellent questions. Arunma, do you want to?
Okay, I'll start. It's a really valid point. The African leaders must be held accountable. We Africans need to be on the driver's seat and need to be the example. However, those who suffer from the consequences of corruption and poor governance suffer more if aid is not scaled up. And today, aid is smarter, and therefore aid is focusing more on making sure that funds and support is directed at those areas and those countries and those governments that are applying good governance practices. So I would actually say that to be able to better hold the African leaders accountable, that President Sarkozy and Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Berlusconi, by honoring their promise, they're better able to help us hold African leaders accountable. That said, there's a lot of progress that we've seen over the recent past on governance in Africa. We're seeing Africans being more demanding of their leaders. We're seeing civil society in Africa being very active, and we're seeing a number of governments responding very positively to the value of good governance and eliminating corruption in Africa. But it's clearly an important issue, and we ourselves at the African Development Bank ensure that the funds that we get from donors and pass on to Africa are guided by the principles of good governance. In fact, for you to be able to benefit from the African Development Fund, we have a performance-based allocation system, which means that the higher performers get more of the money, and one of the critical indicators in our performance-based allocation is actually issues around governance.
Yes, I would just want to say, that we have been very badly served by many of our African leaders. They have been lousy, and we ought to be quite clear about that and unequivocal. Part of the problem, of course, has been that we've not always been able to have a vibrant civil society. It's developing in many places now where they are getting to say we want an accountable government. And I think, that one of the good things about having a black president in the White House is that he can, and I hope he does, say to them, look here, you guys, I am one of you. Don't let me down by being as lousy as some of you have been. And they can't accuse him of being sort of neo-colonialist because, yeah, the complexion helps. But I think, though, too, we mustn't forget how people were subverted by the West. You know, we had a Savimbi in Angola because the United States wanted him there as a surrogate in the Cold War. Mobutu, was buttressed by his. Yes, you still have to say, why did they agree to be used in that fashion? They were used. And we've got to say, we hope, that the West will clean their slate too, and not use some of our gullible leaders in the fashion that they did in the past. I am going.
Okay,
wonderful. Thank God.
Archbishop Tutu is leading us. We might try and keep going for one more question afterwards.
We'll get some sense now, ladies and gentlemen, in a minute.
He's supposed to be